Torsten Bell. I'm your chair for today. I'm the director of an organisation called the Resolution Foundation. We're a kind of economics research institute that works on the living standards of those on low and middle incomes. Welcome to this Festival of the Future City event. Before I kick off, actually, I'd say most of you, some of us have slept from London on the 5:30 train this morning or something awful. That's probably a lie, 6:30, painfully early. But whenever I come to do these events in Bristol, I do always think, because you probably don't know how unusual it is. Like, this does not happen everywhere. Like, the level of like public debate and civic engagement, admittedly with like one part of the Bristol community, but still is like, you know, to put it another way, you're all really weird compared to like the country as a whole. So you should be happy about that. I think you should be happy about that. We're happy about that. I think it's a good thing for society. Now, we're here today to talk about social mobility, or the lack of it, and that in the end comes down to two big ideas, this debate. One is the idea that each generation should do better than the last. That's one core component, that human progress, that societal progress is based on that generational progress. And the other related idea, which is that talent, or merit, or whatever you want to call it, should decide where you end up in life, not where you come from, not where you were born, not your parents' wealth. Those are the two ideas. And those ideas have been around for a very long time. And cities have always been central to those ideas. On the first, because cities have been the place that drive the new ideas, the new technology, the new ways of working that, until recently at least, drove that generational on generational progress, income growth that we hear about. And secondly, because we thought of cities as open places where anybody could come to take part in that progress and to get to where their talents would let them go. That was the theory. That's like the Dick Whittington story. For those that don't remember, he's the guy that turns up from a poor Gloucestershire family, arrives in London in that case, he goes to the city, he makes an absolute fortune with the help of new technology, which in his case was a cat that was really good at catching rats. That was the technology, and I think this is like, I don't know what it is, he's like 1450 something or 1480, I don't know, make it up. He becomes like mayor of London 4 times, he's really rich, I think he becomes an MP, I think he lends money to like 3 different kings. He's like, this is as good as it gets in like 1450s, 1490s. That is proper social mobility. The only problem was, it turned out that when you got past that myth, the guy was like born into the gentry, his grandfather was a sir. I think what else did he have? Oh, that was right, and he was best mates with his kings amongst the problems. So he was like less Slumdog Millionaire, and he was more Jacob Rees-Mogg becomes Richard Branson or something. He was more like that, which is not good for anyone involved in the process. So it's never really been true, obviously, our kind of stories about social mobility. Everyone knows parental income determines both educational outcomes and the jobs we do. Wealth determines the wealth of the next generation, particularly in Britain today. And the role of cities in this story has always been more mixed. And there's obviously tensions between the drivers in cities that drive that wealth accumulation, that economic progress, and what that means for social mobility for the people that actually live there. So hopefully that's the kind of thing we were going to discuss. If that wasn't what you were thinking you were coming for this morning, the door is there, but please don't go. You've got a great panel to help you discuss it, who are going to give us about 5 to 7 minutes each before we have 30 minutes for questions and answers. If you've got answers, you can give us those as well. But I was going to introduce the panel quickly before we kick off. So on the far right, they're going to run from my right to my left. So Paul Gregg is a professor of economic and social policy at the University of Bath. But before you get angry, he does live in Bristol. He doesn't have to come very far. People in Bath might be wondering where he is. But he also sits on every commission under the sun. Social Mobility Commission, helpfully. The Living Wage Commission, which we run at the Resolution Foundation to calculate living wage rates for the country. On his left is Anna Dixon, who's the Chief Executive of Ageing Better, and was previously lucky enough to be the Director of Strategy for the Department of Health. So you can have a word with her after about all the bad operations. Anything else that went wrong, it's probably Anna's fault. Kit Duval is a writer whose debut novel, My Name is Leon, was a bestseller, shortlisted for a whole long list of awards I'm not going to read out, but including the Costa Awards. But she also works to support talented students from deprived backgrounds to get progress. And I kind of don't need to introduce Marvin really, but Marvin has worked at charities, the BBC and the NHS, so most of our national treasures he has worked for, and he's now trying to become a national treasure by being the mayor. You see what I did there?
Yeah, I saw that. That's nice.
I felt like there was an underappreciation for it, but I'm glad that you pulled it back at the end. He's now trying to become one as your mayor of Bristol, and is doing a good job. And I read your State of the City, was that 2 days ago or last night?
2 days ago.
2 days ago. That was good. Although I also read on the way up the stairs. Did you read the comments? Anyone read the comments on the board? I'm going to come back. One of them said, good lecture, good talk, but didn't deal with public toilets. And the other one, just to live up to every Bristol stereotype, said, great, brilliant, covered the waterfront. You see what they're doing. But really not enough on spirituality. So next time.
See, my nickname from some of the trolls is Reverend Rees. So I don't know how they get that.
Okay, fine. We'll come back to that later. So hopefully that again is the panel you're expecting. We're going to, as I say, run from right to left, and then we're going to get your questions. So, Paul, over to you to kick us off.
Right, okay, so I'm going to sort of give a little bit of a story about what the nature of social mobility problem is in the UK and how it's been evolving. And then I'm going to touch on how Bristol looks on this kind of space, and if I've got time I might start talking a bit about policy areas to focus. Right. As Torsten said, we tend to think of social mobility in two different ways. The one which we've long debated and has been a long part of study is about differential life chances for kids who come from relatively affluent or deprived backgrounds. And we, the UK, look bad on that kind of measure compared to most other developed countries. Only the US and Italy look like us in the extent to which kids from deprived backgrounds have life chances on a range of outcomes, which are much worse than those from affluent families. As an aside, that's what's defining those countries which have really bad sets of outcomes from relatively deprived kids is that they're countries with high levels of inequality, right? And so us, Italy and America are amongst the most unequal countries amongst the developed nations. Northern Europe, Scandinavia tends to do much better on this kind of story, okay? But we've long sort of discussed that, and we've had it on the policy agenda for some time. But the other dimension we tended to ignore. And the other dimension is each generation doing better than the previous generation? So even if kids are staying relatively poor when they come from poor families, are they better off than their parents? And we basically took that as the 20th century promise. We took it almost as a given, right? But for the last 10, 15 years, that has dried up, right? So that we are now entering a situation where young people in their mid-20s and mid-30s are earning the same as people were doing 16, 20 years ago at the same age, right? That idea of generational progress has stopped. To put the two together makes it kind of really nasty, yeah? If you have little progress in relative terms of moving away from being poor, and you're not advancing as a country to make all parts of society richer, you've got real stagnation at the bottom end of the distribution of poverty, meaning poverty across generations. So that's the kind of problem. We've now, in a sense, added a new dimension to the problem, but the first one, the relative story, has improved a little bit, right? So that the relative life chances on educational outcomes have narrowed a bit over the last 10 to 15 years. And a little bit in the labour market too in the last 10 years. But the big one that hasn't narrowed at all, and you'll be no surprised about this, is housing. Right? Because housing is the principal source of wealth for most people, right? And it's becoming increasingly socially segregated. Young people are struggling to get onto the housing ladder. I think you know that. It's an acute problem in Bristol. But the disappearing people, the people in each generation who are no longer getting on the housing ladder, who used to when in previous generations, are those that come from relatively poor families. Even if they're educationally successful themselves, they can't get on the housing ladder now because you need access, in a sense, to parental wealth, right? Either handed down or second, you know, they're borrowing against the parental house in order to raise the capital to get the mortgages in areas where house prices are high relative to people's earnings. Right, so I'm just going to say what's the story about Bristol and all of that kind of stuff, right? Bristol is a lively, vibrant, fun kind of place, right? Bohemian in many ways, progressive, huge swings to Labour at the last election. But on all of those kind of metrics, bar one, Bristol looks really bad in terms of social mobility. Educational opportunities at preschool, at school, secondary school, GCSEs, A-levels are incredibly low for those coming from poor families within the Bristol story. Progression into the labour market is weak for those who come from deprived families. The one good story is wages, right? So Bristol is good on wages. The level of people being paid at least a living wage is high compared to most other cities in the country. That's the positive side of it. And then, as I just mentioned, the housing side of it is also very bad. Yeah. So home ownership amongst those from relatively deprived parts of the population is low in Bristol compared to other places. Okay. So this is a map, if you like, of what the problem is nationally. And it also says what the problem is locally, because Bristol's problems are really the same as most of the national problems. Educational deficits turning up early in life and progressing right through the school, a lack of progression into university, and particularly elite universities from those from relatively high backgrounds. Labour market story is not so bad, but the housing story is pretty rough. If we want to talk about policy, and I'm conscious that I'm going to be running out of time, is that we've got to look at all of those kinds of spaces and think about what an opportunity city would look like to open those kind of doors at each of those stages. Early years, schools, transition into the labour market, progression in the labour market, and access to housing. And there's quite a lot of policy potential space which a city which was minded to do and had some resources, which is a kind of an issue, right, could try to do to open up those kind of spaces to the relatively deprived within the city of Bristol.
Great, thank you, Paul. As you can kind of tell, Paul really lifts the mood at a party. Everyone's always like, that guy can come back. Right, Anna.
Great, thanks very much. So some of you might be wondering why an organisation that's focused on ageing is in a session on social mobility. And I think, as we've heard from some of the others, there's a lot of focus on early opportunity, early in life, and how that can promote social mobility. So I want you to hold two thoughts in mind as I speak. One is that inequality accumulates over the life course. So the inequalities and challenges that people face in later life have their antecedents much earlier in life. And the second thing that I want you to hold in mind is we often talk about generations as cohorts, so millennials versus baby boomers. But actually, and I think Paul illustrated this point, we are interdependent across generations, and particularly in terms of private transfers of wealth up and down. So just hold those two things in mind as we speak and debate about social mobility. So I just want to make three quick points. Firstly, cities are ageing, but not everyone is ageing equally. So the facts are pretty stark that by 2025, 1 in 4 of us in the UK will be 65 and over. Now, we tend to think that cities are going to be okay. They're younger, more dynamic, and certainly compared to the sort of coastal retirement zones, like perhaps Torbay, they're going to be okay. Well, the fact is that in 20 years' time, everywhere pretty much will look like Torbay today. So we are ageing very rapidly. The challenge, though, particularly for cities, that would be fine if we were all going to be healthy and free of disability into those older ages. But cities are some of the places with the lowest healthy life expectancy at 65. And this is very much because the inequalities that we see within our cities persist into later life and cause people to have earlier health problems and earlier disability. So the second point that I want to make is that cities can be great places to grow old, but that changes are needed. And I'll just highlight some of those. We need to ensure that there are, for now and the future, homes that are not only safe and warm and affordable, but also that are accessible and adaptable. Because otherwise we're going to find people, particularly low-income home owners, stuck in inappropriate housing that is both bad for their health and causes them not to be able to have a good quality of life. We need transport infrastructure, public transport that's not just focused on getting commuters around, but is focused on neighbourhoods and the sort of active transport policies that enable people to walk and age healthily and actively. We also need to create places that promote positive intergenerational relationships, making sure that social spaces are really there for people of all ages, that they're inclusive, and that communities themselves are able to make sure everyone can make a valuable contribution. And I think that's really at the heart of resilient communities. So, as I say, cities can be great places to grow old, but I'm not sure if you held up that list and sort of said, does Bristol do those things, that you would necessarily, take all the boxes. In terms of the third thing, many cities are already committed to becoming more inclusive, becoming age-friendly. But I think we do need to accelerate and spread that change, given the very immediate demographic shift that we're going to face over the next 10 to 20 years. And it's a global movement. There are already 18 communities, all of the core cities, and I'm really delighted that Bristol are considering and hopefully might be committing to become an age-friendly city potentially later this year. So why is this important? I think we see sometimes the ageing population as a drag on the economy, and people focus on the health and social care bill and potentially the pension and welfare bill. But I think there is an opportunity to see the ageing population also as drivers of economic growth. One of the challenges is that at the moment only about half of people are working at 65. So cities need to create economic opportunity for people over 50, particularly between 50 and state pension age. If they're not in work, that is not only bad for them, but it's also bad for the economy. If we can get those people working, it's obviously accessing jobs and skills, but also putting money into the local economy. So I think that an age-inclusive place, one that gives opportunity to people at all stages and ages, is at the heart of economic inclusive growth. So I suppose that we're very much promoting that longer lives can be an opportunity both for individuals and for cities, but we've really got to take action at all stages of the life course to make sure that everyone has the same chance of enjoying later life.
Great, thank you, Anna. That is a good reminder that it's not all about the youthies. Kit.
I am going to talk about the youthies.
Right, back to the youth.
Even younger than the youthies. So I'm the fake here because I'm not an academic, but I first of all want to talk about the concept of social mobility, which has always, to me, given the impression that there's something wrong with being working class and that we are all desperately trying to be middle class, and that drive to be socially mobile means that you are moving away from, and that this working class life is a temporary thing that you actually need to get out of. And I've always had an issue with that, and I feel like it should be more economic mobility or some other kind of mobility, but talking about social mobility, which I completely agree with, that especially when it comes to poverty, that there needs to be a way out of poverty, but that social mobility seems to devalue what it means to be working class, as though there's no value in working class communities, working class lives, and that most people that are working class are quite happy to be working class and to have their community, their rights, their rituals, their way of doing things. Of course, no one wants bad housing, no one wants poor education, no one wants no access to services, but that social mobility thing has always sat quite not very well with me. Although, obviously I'm here on this panel, I completely agree that there needs to be processes by which people can get themselves out of poverty. What I'm going to talk about mainly is the children that I have seen who live in poverty, the most vulnerable children. I worked for 15 years in criminal law and in family law, and I've worked in prisons for many, many years. And what I've seen is how parental disengagement very often leads to children being unable to partake of even services that are there. So even when they're children as young as 3 or 4 are in a good nursery or in a good school, parental disengagement, parental problems, usually generated by lack of money, have meant that children cannot engage, cannot be socially mobile, with everything offered to them on a plate. If you took the best scenario possible, great school, great carers, whatever, parental disengagement usually means that the children are battling something else and cannot partake of social mobility. Therefore, to ameliorate that, we need to start with the parents. We need to start with changing parental life chances, parental access to services, parental housing to influence the children. Without that, what I've seen hundreds, if not thousands of times, are children who are absolutely clever, beautiful, smart, exactly the sort of child that you would expect to succeed in any other family, going into care, which is a terrible broken attachment. I've got 2 adoptive children. I'm very pro-adoption, very pro-foster care, but it is definitely not the ideal for many, many children. Going into care, if you look at prisons, if you look at mental health institutions, children that have been in the care system are way overrepresented in prisons and in mental institutions, because the care system is not always, obviously for some children it's great, for a lot of children it is definitely second best. It means broken attachment after broken attachment. Children in the care system have what's called care careers, where they may move 22 times between the ages of 6 and 16 because they're difficult. And those children are never able to be socially mobile. They go into prison, which is one of the most destructive factors for anybody to think about then home ownership, although I take issue with home ownership. I mean, the continent do very, very well without massive home ownership because they have a much better model of social housing. But if you have been to prison, the chances of you then becoming a homeowner are very, very low. If you have been to prison, you very often replicate through no fault of your own the family circumstances you brought up, and it means in a broken attachment, it means a broken family, and that is perpetuated on those children of prisoners very, very often. So for me, social mobility, whilst a great thing, needs to address parental engagement with children primarily. That means mothers, unfortunately, very often. Good housing and good education, and all of those things cannot substitute for parental engagement and parental safety and parental security. And that's where I would like to see social mobility, which I call economic mobility very often. I'd like to see it start there and have that big push at the beginning of life, so that, as Anna said, towards as you age, those difficulties can be lessened.
Great, thank you very much, Kit. So Marvin, that's a long list of what we'd all like at our perfect city. If you could just tell us how it's going to turn up tomorrow, that'd be good, and then we can all go home happy.
Well, so I've been making notes as we go, just prompting my thoughts and stuff you're saying now. I was just thinking that piece about identity, because I guess in many ways I'll be an example of social mobility. You know, white mum, brown baby, single, poor, 1970s, couldn't find anywhere to live in Bristol because it wasn't seen as acceptable. I got 7 brothers and sisters that I know of. I think there were 4 or 5 different mums between us. So and end up near the city. But there is an interesting thing about it, because I struggle with who I am with all that. Add to that my mixedness, my mixed heritage. And who am I? You know, when I was looking at doing A-levels, I remember some of my friends saying, Marvin, that's what white guys do. Why are you doing that? So actually my journey through this social mobility has been interesting. And I guess there's a strong rootedness in my sense of who I am anyway, and my own self-worth that I've found over time, not originally, that's given me an anchor within that. So there are interesting dynamics within that. And when I think about the causes, I think back to some of my friends. I remember arriving at university. I've said to kids who are off to university now, you're going to be overwhelmed by rich kids when you meet them. But if I'd known at that age what I know now, I would have said, we're at the same, how much did your parents spend to get you here? My parents spent nothing, and we're at the same university. So pound for pound, skill for skill, hour for hour, I've done better than you. Whereas I used to feel so intimidated.
You could just say hello, first of all.
Yeah, well,
I mean, if that's the first thing you say, it's going to be really awkward. I mean,
well, you can find out what they said to me.
All right, okay.
First. But, you know,
it's really bad party with you and Paul.
Yeah, I took that line, actually, is inspired by Good Will Hunting, the Harvard bar scene. But yeah, so there's a lot of interesting dynamics. So why some of my friends who were bigger, faster, smarter, more charismatic, more confident than me, why did they not end up doing similar things to me? Some of them ended up dead, some ended up in prison, some are just surviving. And yet the talent that was there was unquestionable. I mean, it's incredibly complicated, a mix of social dynamics, experiences at school, what's going on in the home life, the culture around them, what their sense of hope was. And in fact, Martin Luther King once said, how can I ask people on the street not to be violent when the biggest purveyor of violence in my own world is my own government, and using violence to solve all its problems? Some of the pathways some of my friends went on, looking for money, was exactly it was what we were being told to do. It's just that the tools they had to go and pursue money ended up taking them to prison and ended up with street lifestyles. And they were displaying exactly the same values as people who rob people's pension funds and rob the country for their own ends, ultimate selfishness. But what we do, anyway, that's a broader. But what we're doing in Bristol, one of the things that's been said, I mean, we've made a big priority for those of you who live here about building homes. We committed to work experience and apprenticeships to provide them to every young child in the city. It's going to be a massive, we've got 5,000 kids coming through in a future cohort, but that's our ambition, to make sure that every kid gets access to good quality work experience. We managed to keep all of our children's centres open. We've got massive cuts, but we believe this is a massive early intervention, but we know that pays off, as you say, public health background myself, the life course description of how poverty and disadvantage accumulates itself, leaving people ill-equipped to cope with the next set of challenges that come. We absolutely recognise that. We actually want to look at parenting skills. You've got to be careful about the nanny state, but I'm on a parenting course now. And I was with some guys last night, and they do a program on BCFM, a community radio station, which is a couple of black dads talking about being a father and the challenges that come with that. So we want to invest in that, and we're trying to make sure that all the big infrastructure work that comes through that we're planning for Bristol, that we equip local people with the skills to be able to get those jobs in the first instance. But there's something about that, even though these are very practical, that's really unsatisfactory to me, because there's a proverb that says you strain gnats and swallow camels. We will do our best to equip people to navigate, but there's something busted about the way stuff works around us that is somewhat beyond us. And for the sake of time, I'll just say one last thing. The point you make about resources as well and cities is massively important. One of the themes that's been running through, that I've been making, a number of us have been making, that there's an over-reliance on nation-state politics, and we need a shift in the sovereignty, a rebalancing sovereignty between national governments and city, regional, local leaders. National governments are ill-equipped to cope with inequality, climate change, national identity, but I think these are things that actually, if we released city sovereignty to begin to lead the way and influence not just what happens inside the city boundaries, but the national and international context in which cities have to live, that we can open the doors on kind of new ways of approaching problems that we've been unable to tackle in the past. And I'll leave it there for the discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Marvin. There's a lot in that about kind of economic mobility. I don't know, it's too late to change the slides, but we kind of get where you're going about the scale of that challenge. I mean, obviously we've got a national government which is kind of busy on some other stuff right now. You probably noticed. But the kind of positive news, as you say, Marvin, is that we know both from data across the world about how different cities in the same country can have very different economic mobility outcomes, very different. The United States is unbelievable. Even cities really near each other in the same state can have totally different outcomes. Now in the States, race is a huge part of that. Yeah. Here it's sometimes part of that, but it's lots of other things as well. Now, we've got about half an hour for your questions, or as I say, your answers. Is there a mic? Answers. Roaming. If you've got answers, we can just cut to that. Everyone can go home. It's all done. There's a gentleman here in the middle. And if others want to raise their hands, we'll take a few at a time. Oh, go.
Matt Griffith, I work for Bristol Initiative. I represent the business community and the wider community of civic leadership. I do a lot of work on housing, but I'm not going to ask a question about that because it's too depressing.
You should work harder, Matt. If you work on it and it's depressing, what are you doing?
This is one on education and scope for being positive and learning from learning experience, really, particularly for Paul. I think in Bristol there is a couple of things to think about as opportunities. One is we are seeing a massive inflow of quite a lot of new people, often highly talented. That could potentially be a force of social polarisation. But in schooling terms, it does a couple of things. Firstly, Bristol did have quite a lazy consensus, which if you made money, you moved out of Bristol, you went to you opted out of the state system. You now have a series of people who are invested in the inner city and want to send their kids to state schools. The other thing is, practically, we now have lots of demand for school places, which means new schools, new openings, new regimes around entrance criteria. So we have a couple of academies who are doing random allocation now. How can we learn from London, and how can we use the potential opportunities we've got here to make sure our school system's more inclusive and drives economic mobility?
That is very good, and it's good to have some optimism about Bristol school systems, because it is a disaster. And there's a lady 2 rows in front of you if you want to pass it forward.
Yes, hi. I'm Pat Connor. I'm director of BBC Bristol and BBC across the southwest. And I've got a couple of questions. I was really interested, Kit, in what you were talking about in terms of parenting. And, you know, I've got an interesting social mobility story myself, and normally you just wouldn't kind of want to share that, but I was really inspired with what Marvin said, because actually the context sometimes is really helpful. And I do sort of share my story sometimes with other colleagues. You know, I grew up in a council estate in Gloucestershire with a mum who was a waitress and was widowed when we were very young with a bunch of kids. I started at the BBC when I was as a volunteer, and I'd come back as the director. That's quite unusual in that kind of organisation. I'm really happy to say that it's getting better, but the reason that I share that story is because it was all down to my mum, actually, because she was incredible and strong and determined, and I would really like to think or help or support ways in which we can really install something that's good for parents. Because it, you know, I think the responsibility with parenting and educating parents and helping and supporting parents is really important. So I was really kind of, you know, inspired to hear what your thoughts were, and I think that's something that I would love to help with. The other point I wanted to make is, we're talking about cities, but you know, we live in a very rural part of the country, and we've got parts of kind of Greater Bristol and the region that are not in the city, and that's where we get some of the most deprived communities, you know, with not a great transport infrastructure, a lot of people that voted for Brexit, a lot of people that are really, really struggling. And I just think that that is something as well that we need to really kind of recognise. Although the subject and the theme is about cities, it's really forgetting half of the story if we're forgetting about all of those communities that just live out of town.
Great, thank you much. Does anyone else want to come in before we go back to the panel? And there's a lady in the blue cardigan.
Hi there, I'm Blossom Young. I work for a housing regeneration association in East London. I'm really interested in a couple of the descriptions around the importance of older people and economic activity and social activity, actually, and juxtaposed with that parental disengagement and early life chances, and where there might be opportunities at a city level or indeed at a neighbourhood level. It strikes me there's something about getting back to communities being places where people of all ages are helpful and supportive of each other. And I know there's some interesting models in Finland around kindergartens and the role of older people in that. And I wondered whether there were, what the panel's thoughts were on things which could help to generate or stimulate that at that level.
Great. Why don't we start on that last one then? Anna, that is kind of directed.
Yeah, I mean, I think whether it's around grandparenting, there's a lot of people who are doing at least quite significant amounts of childcare, and recognising that and being able to create those parenting skills and developmental support and attachment relationships that may be missing from their own parents, I think is something that we maybe haven't woken up to and done enough. I know some children's centres are running special sessions just sort of for grandparents to come in with kids, but I think that's an opportunity where that is going on within families. And I think you're right to say, can we extend this beyond family to community? And certainly in the US, there's a very big initiative around, reading in schools and, mobilising older residents in areas to mentor younger kids. And there are programmes about matching people coming out of care to older mentors. So I do think there are small initiatives around building these intergenerational relationships that are about mutual give and take between older generations and younger people, but I'm sure that there's much more that we could do, and I think the hardest bit is how do you create that in an informal way and sort of regenerate those more informal connections in places. I think you often need the voluntary sector to sort of stimulate and make some of that happen, but I definitely think there's a huge opportunity there to do more around that.
Just to add to the perk, is there anywhere in the UK that's done it really well, that's got a good thing happening?
As I say, there are small initiatives, but I don't think that I would sort of point to a place where that is really happening. And the only other point I think on the education that was raised by Matt is also recognising the sort of need for lifelong learning. So, one of the challenges for cities is if all of the job opportunities are filled by people coming in, that often is placing even more strain on housing and more strain on infrastructure. And obviously with Brexit, there's also a question about where some of those workers are actually going to come from. And yet, in effect, sitting within the cities are many people between 50 and state pension age who want to be working. And either the jobs that they did they're no longer able to do because of health issues, and they need employers who can actually support them. They may need some retraining because the skills that they have don't match the jobs available. So I think older apprenticeship schemes, looking really at the adult education offer and thinking about lifelong learning and recognising if we're going to work till we're 70, we've got to keep investing in people's training and development beyond 50. We cannot live in a society where you get to 55 and people are going, oh well, I'm not going to invest in any more training and education for them because they have a lot more to give, and we need to create opportunity. Sorry, that's
we
very long.
We asked for some perk, and you ended on working till 70.
It's like that's a positive.
No, think yourself. Right there, Marvin.
Sorry,
Matt,
can I just
you were
say
coming on
one
that? Yeah,
thing
cool.
about what somebody said about communities? One of the things, if we talk about the Grenfell disaster, one of the things that the survivors of the disaster have spoken about, as well as the loss of their home and the trauma and everything, is the loss of their community, because there is such a lot of good and value and strength and resilience in working class communities that's underappreciated, which is why sort of social mobility sticks in my throat slightly, as though we're all trying to get out of that state of being working class, which we're not. And I think investing more in working class communities leads to shared parenting very often. You have lots of stories where a child is looked after by that neighbour, or if that child's in trouble, it can go to that neighbour. And that cohesive community is actually where there needs to be investment in the existing structures that go on without any governmental intervention, without any help from anybody. There are just really cohesive, supportive communities already existing that need to be bolstered and not destroyed by gentrification, by those communities being, split up and farmed out so that people are having to start again, particularly single mothers. And about social mobility, where it comes to mothers encouraging their children, and it was sad to say often is single mothers who have children who say, right, this is what's going to happen now. It's about supporting those mothers to go to work with better childcare, with better access to leisure opportunities, which sometimes are 5 miles away. And talking about rural exclusion, it's a massive, massive problem for single parents particularly. Transport is abysmal. Loads of rural areas don't have the internet. You're still on some sort of gas-powered dial-up internet thing. And it's not going to help when there are resources in cities that people in rural areas can't even access.
Now, Marvin, Matt hopefully took responsibility for the housing problem in Bristol, but he was a bit perkier on educational change and opportunities.
Well, housing we've made it a top priority for the city because we know it's just the massive challenge, and my own family are challenged by it now. I mean, and it's about the volume of housing. It's about the number of affordable homes. There's no point building if people can't afford to live there. But actually, there's an overspill. There's an interplay with education as well. One that I feel, right? Because this point, when you talked about gentrification, this is one of our challenges. Where I grew up in Easton, I mean, you couldn't give those. My mum bought a house for £16,000 on a discount. Houses in Easton, in my part now, are like £380,000. You know, and actually, what's gone into that is the gentrification. You know, and if a number of us started talking about it about 5 years ago, and now it seems to be a fashionable thing. But what's interesting is the sources of the conversation of gentrification come from the gentrifiers. It's the bohemian, socially progressive activists who couldn't possibly have a problem with racial integration, but don't have a really diverse race and class, diverse friendship group, who are some of the most vocal voices in progressive political Bristol politics. But that gentrification then overspills into the schools as well, and we could be seeing some interesting dynamics around that. Certainly, some of my neighbours are coping with that as well. But the parenting thing is so important. If I can just pick up on that, because I love it and I find it incredibly dangerous as well. So it is true. You know, one of the challenges I had for some of my friends coming back is, all right, we have issues in the education system. You know, race has been an issue, right? And we know that. But what would happen if parents accepted and demanded nothing less than excellence from their children? And I've seen that. I've seen that happen. And that's why we want to do something about parenting and parenting skills. There's a charity called Nalari in Bristol, did a whole series of work around masculinity, looking at men who'd been in prison. And there's a fantastic line where a man says, I was the worst father, but I'm going to be the best grandfather I can be. And actually playing a proactive role now in reconnecting with his children and understanding the role he plays in his grandchildren's life prospects and his children. Now, while parenting can be the solution in many ways, it is not the cause. It's not the sole cause. Bad parenting is not the sole cause. And I just don't want to end up in a space where people think, well, if we only just sorted out the parents, we'd have social mobility. And none of us are saying that. I just want to make sure we put that on the record. Housing, racism, class bias, social connectivity, people purchasing connectivity into social networks. Even in, I think in your latest report, Glass Floors, right, that talks about high ability people from poor backgrounds have worse life chances than low ability people from wealthy backgrounds. Now, I cracked that as a gag a few years ago. Social immobility doesn't just mean that good people don't go up, it means stupid people don't come down. These are the realities, right? And we can all be progressive until someone says, well, actually, my kid's smarter than your kid, and can I get the place in the school that your kid's going to? And then we start to work in our vested interests within our family units and our social networks. So I just say it's really complicated. Personal choice, parenting, yeah, but we can't lose sight of those social forces around us as well.
I mean, just on that, on your another classic line for a party about your kid taking their kid's place and stuff. But like on the bit that Paul said at the beginning, like one of the problems the country faces at the moment is because we're not seeing this generational on generational progress on incomes, earnings, housing, all kinds of things. It becomes much more zero sum. Like if everything's progressing, then yes, some people have to fall down relatively, but they can still be better off than their parents, so they don't feel it quite as acutely. But in a world where people aren't progressing, falling down means in absolute terms you are poorer than your parents. You're not growing up you're not bringing your kids up in the terraced house you grew up with, and it feels socially more zero sum than it does, and that is definitely that's why it becomes a big. It's not just an individual challenge; it becomes like a social cohesion challenge for all of us. Either we haven't dealt with the semi-rural transport things. Paul, do you want to say about that? No, you're not really into your rural, are you? No. Okay, fine.
Well, I'm very conscious of talking about the city a lot. I have to recognise that, and I think in terms of this part of the country, as a combined authority, this is something that we have to take into account. We have to recognise our interdependence.
I would like to say a few things about the parenting stuff. Yeah. So, I mean, early years is regularly seen as kind of the place where you need to make the kind of big interventions, and some people argue that that's where the big returns are. In the UK, we've made big interventions in childcare, early years childcare, huge spending increases in that kind of space. But it hasn't really narrowed educational gaps in the early part of school years, even where we've made big increases in the level of early years education. And part of that discussion needs to be about the quality of early years education. It isn't just about childcare, it needs to be about the educational content of early years education. But another strand of it, which is in a sense where the part that we're not getting the investment in, and the part where we've seen a number of attempts to try and change the dynamic, which have all run into the sand, is parenting support in the early years type programs. So Labour introduced Sure Start, a high spend. You know, you mentioned about keeping the children's centres open in Bristol, but that has, you know, the funding for that has almost completely disappeared. Some progressive authorities are trying to keep some vestige of what Sure Start was doing alive, but by and large, the government cut it from its required spend, made it optional for local authorities to do it, and most local authorities faced with spending cuts cut it back. This government, the coalition, made a big attempt to introduce something called Family Nurse Partnership, which is a kind of home visiting early support program where nurses work with parents right through pregnancy into the early years about smoking in pregnancy, early years interventions to try and boost learning and interaction with children. Major scale investment. The early evaluations came out that it wasn't moving the big health outcomes they were concerned about, such as smoking in pregnancy. It's been cut. It's been given to local authorities to run rather than the health service, so it stopped being a national programme, starts becoming a local one, starts becoming discretionary. Lots of local authorities can't afford to do it. It's disappearing from the scene again. We have systematically talked the talk about parenting support interventions, but we have systematically failed to deliver them on a sustained basis and really find out what they can do in terms of changing those life course trajectories which we've been talking about. Every time we've made the kind of the first steps, a change of government, a change of a regime in terms of austerity means that it's run into the sand and been cut back and abandoned, essentially. If we're going to try and talk about that about Bristol, if we have the resources, there are things which we could be trying to do to try and introduce local-based, evidence-based early parenting support type programs. If we still have children's centre infrastructure, that's a good base to try and deliver them from. But let's start having that kind of conversation. And let's do it in a way that we can really demonstrate what the long-term benefits are to the kids and to society from those kind of intensive support programs for deprived kids.
Let's get some more questions in before we run out of time. There's a cluster. Why don't you take all three? Just, oh no, you can't. They're all men. Come on. You can have two of you men are allowed. The two on the right. White t-shirt. Come on first. No, the white, green can wait. Go on, the white.
Hello.
Yep.
Thank you. My name's Alex. I'm also from Popular Greens. Just wanted to ask what the panel's thoughts were on certain measures being taken by European countries such as Switzerland and Finland on the notion of universal income, and whether that's a basic universal income, whether that's potentially a progressive measure that could help sort of start to level out the playing field in terms of life chances at a very early stage, or whether perhaps it's a crude quick fix if the surrounding infrastructure and support networks that you've talked about in terms of access to skills and jobs and education aren't really there.
It's definitely not a quick fix, whatever it is. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name's Danny, and I think the chat around parental skills and parental opportunities has been really great, and it's been clear that it's quite a difficult thing to make successful interventions in, because it's a very private thing and it's based around habits and lifelong learning that is very difficult to change. But I was wondering if you had any examples from the UK or internationally of programs where they have been really successful in trying to make like interventions in parental skills, which have then led to the outcomes that we've all been like unlocking all of those other things that are then there, like transport or education or jobs and skills.
Okay, great question. Anyone else want to come? And there's a lady right here at the front. We've got time for one more set after this, if the panel is well behaved on the answers.
Thanks. My name's Alan Dent. I'm a freelance consultant. I work mainly in employment skills. So something we panel hasn't mentioned about very much is work. So it was great to hear that Bristol's really focused on getting young people work experience and apprenticeships. Really important for young people to get that experience of the world of work. But I think just your organisation just this week has published a report on how many people get stuck in low-paid work. So even though we're helping young people to enter the world of work, how do we help them progress? Because people get stuck in low-paid work, sometimes for their whole career.
Great, thank you for the plug. Paul, you can't do both of these, but do you want to quickly say UBI, but then and list the American programs that the guy can go and read the reports on parenting?
Okay, so it's a slight misnomer that people talk about Finland experimenting with UBI. Actually, what they're experimenting with is something a bit closer to our tax credit system. It's not a full universal basic income. But universal basic income is the idea that everybody gets a unconditional payment. Every adult gets every week, let's call it 100 quid, right, with no strings attached, right, and everybody can then choose whether to work more to top that up or not. But if it's sort of at a level which allows people to have a low but acceptable living standard even when they're not working, and to raise it afterwards. The big push on it recently has come from the technology companies in the US, right? They are worried about that there's going to be a reaction against robotisation if it starts displacing lots of people from jobs or starts devaluing jobs heavily. Yeah, that the value of jobs, or particularly middle and middle upper skill kind of jobs, become devalued, replaced by robots doing law, doing surgery, doing all kinds of things, and so they're sort of advocating this. And there's sort of one message which needs to be sort of had. There are a few countries which have universal basic incomes, and they're all countries which have some kind of resource, which means that they don't tax their people to pay for it. Right? They have oil wealth, or they have diamond mines or something in Botswana. So they've got a mechanism of funding it, which isn't just taxing people's incomes more, because giving people income and then taxing it back is a little bit daft, right? Yeah, right. So you're increasing people's tax rates to pay for it is not the sensible option. The space where it gets interesting, or to put it another way, there's much better ways of helping low-income families than giving rich people a universal basic income, right? You want to target it better, right? Where it gets more interesting is if we're talking about taxing technology or taxing wealth or capital, which we don't do in this country seriously. In fact, most countries don't do it. We don't tax wealth, we don't tax capital, right? And we don't tax robots. Right? So if we're moving into a world where robotisation is destroying jobs or devaluing heavily, there is a potential to be thinking about how you might tax that value and redistribute it to people. But just to put the big caveat on all of that right now, is our problem in the UK is not no jobs. Right? We've got record low unemployment, we've got record high employment. Our problem is no bloody wages. Right? Wages are stagnant now. It's the worst decade we've had for wages since 1860. Right? So a little bit more technology, a little bit more productivity, a little bit more wages is kind of what we want, not worrying too much about jobs right now. Okay.
Does anyone want to defend the UBI? No, I can add to trashing it, but would anyone like to defend it? Anyone keen?
I think the only thing I was going to draw a parallel with is the debates about state pension, and is it a universal basic state pension, which is the direction that it's now moved in, rather than an entitlement that somehow is related to paying in so much about paying in national insurance. There is some link, but we've moved much more towards an idea that it is a basic income.
Yes.
But the question is,
and child benefit has some similarity as well. So you could think of a universal child payment, and have lots of positives about it.
But the debate then is, where is it set? The fact that it is universal means that we're paying an awful lot out to people who also have other income and pension income and don't really need it. But there are 1.9 million pensioners in poverty. The other thing, just on the low pay, we did some work with the Resolution Foundation looking at those lower middle income households, the sort of just about managing, and found that actually that sort of low income households, though about a third of those lower middle income households were headed up by somebody between 50 and state pension age. So this is not just affecting the sort of younger families and working age adults, it is also affecting older households with older workers in as well. So I guess those would just be the 2 points.
I mean, if you're an older worker, clearly, I mean, overall, low pay is like a young person's problem. But if you're talking about being stuck in low pay, it's much more of a problem if you're over 45. So if you're over 45 and you're a low-paid worker, the chances are you're much more likely to be there 10 years later than you are if you're younger.
And you will be the person who relies on state pension.
And
you will have no savings, no pension, and that means that you're very
bring the mood down further.
And can I just also say, putting a value on parenting. So that if it was valued in a monetary sense, in a benefit, so that you were parenting your children, you didn't feel that you had to work 3 jobs and parent, and therefore probably not doing a good job as you could, but having some kind of child benefit that rewarded you for parenting your children, or made it possible that you could parent your child properly, with more time, less going out to work to try and make ends meet, less use of food banks because your benefit doesn't cover what you need to parent your child.
And the same would be true of informal carers who are caring for elderly relatives who, carers allowance is not a thing that you can live off. So
let's just get to any more questions that are left, because I'm conscious that people have to get on with their days. There's a gentleman at the front who wins the Beard of the Room competition. Good.
Hello, I'm Sean Williams. I'm Friends of the Earth regional campaigner for South West England. And one of the things we're working on a lot in Bristol at the moment is air pollution. Already popped a question to Marvin about this, but I'd be interested in the views of the panel as well, in this context particularly, because I think Marvin's got some very sort of valid concerns about the way that this could play out in the city in terms of the effects of trying to tackle air pollution. So it's a really wicked problem in the sense that you've got the people who are most vulnerable to it also could be hit hardest by some of the interventions to it. So there's a great quote which is, there's a piece of graffiti down on the charity shop which says, "Serve first those who suffer most." And it maps on quite well in Bristol to kind of the highest levels of air pollution in the city centre, Lawrence Hill, Easton, but also those people who are most vulnerable to it are children and the elderly. It contributes to dementia, it contributes to all sorts of health problems. So just interested in people's thoughts on how you start to unpick a wicked problem like that, where you have these kind of groups who are disproportionately affected by a problem, but also the difficulty of intervening in that.
Great question. Anyone else? There's a gentleman with the wrist device. Pro-EU. Okay. It's not gone well, I'm afraid. Carol.
We'll see. Just kind of following on from the question just...
What was your name, sir?
Oh, sorry, Ian Townsend from the Bristol Green Water Partnership, the City's Environmental Sustainability Network. Following on from Sean's question, we talked about social mobility up on the screen, and then we've kind of discussed much more about economic mobility, but thinking about this kind of idea that there's 3 dimensions of sustainable development, which are social, environmental and economic. Could we be talking about environmental mobility, and kind of links a little bit to the, well, links directly to the air pollution challenge, but things about green spaces, parks, and should we be factoring that kind of quality of life in terms of nature and space into our...
Great question. Anyone else that want to talk over to that? Okay, let's go check the panel in the meeting. So by Mr. Hand. Oh yes, sorry, go ahead, sir, you can be our finish it off.
Thank you. My name is Anthony Negus. I work around local government. I've noticed in the 40 odd years I've been in Bristol a much greater breaking down of the barriers that were here when I first arrived. There is the understanding that we are, I believe, much more all one society, and there's a great propensity for the middle class, which I think are well represented in this room, although I suspect many, like Bristol as a whole, have come from a working class background. And that's very common in Bristol today, and people want to push out and reach for that. What I'm concerned about is that we are trying to draw lines around communities still. By focusing on the deprived at the moment, we are not reaching out to the ability of other people to join in that process of trying to be one society with everybody helping. There's a lot of will to do that. One of the ways that I think we've gone wrong in this country as a whole is in our housing distribution. It becomes them and us very much. Housing is now aspirational completely. If you lived in Germany, I have a daughter in Germany, you'll know that is just not a dynamic in Germany very much. There are those that live out in the country in villas, but a lot of people in the cities in Germany live in the same sort of flats, in the same sort of blocks, and yet their economic strength is very, very different. Okay. And they integrate much more.
Brilliant.
That's what I would hope we should try and do a lot more of.
Great. Okay, look, we're going to be very quick here. Not everyone talk everything. Just on this air pollution stuff and on Jim Moore about collective inheritance rather than just individual progress of families, about green spaces and environment.
Yeah, this is something we talked about the other day, and we've talked about it, that we can be asking poor people to pay a disproportionate price in relation to their life for a problem that's been generated by an economy that rich people have benefited from, and that has to be a conundrum. But at the same time, poor people paying a disproportionate value. Even I actually think it was one of my challenges to Bristol being European Green Capital. We did not tackle the lack of race and class diversity with the environmental movement during that year, and we should have. That would have been one of the substantial things we could have done about making sure that environmental justice was seen as absolutely undetachable, that's not a very poetic phrase, from social justice, and we didn't take that on. So I'm up for thinking about that conundrum. And I'll just take this thing about social mobility as well and what it is, and I must admit, I would, you might expect me to, Anthony, I do, my sense of otherness within Bristol was not something that was worked up. It was my experience of the city and how it worked. We didn't draw lines around people, lines were drawn around us by the way the city worked. But there's a line, and I think it's worth bearing in mind. H. Rap Brown, if any of you know H. Rap Brown, an activist from the United States, he said, we didn't fight for integration. We weren't fighting to go to school with white folks. We wanted equality. And it comes back to that point. We've got to think about what we're actually, we've got to test this idea. I love the fact that you tested the idea of social mobility. What are we actually working for and getting back? Even Martin Luther King said, look, maybe Martin Luther King, rarely people didn't engage with this, said maybe we need segregation for a while because the aim was not to integrate into inequality. The aim was for power, equal standing. And I think all these ideas about what we're actually working for when we easily say social mobility is not that everyone could be middle class. It is not that our communities can be pulled apart. We've got to be thinking about what is that picture we're working towards. And I think sometimes we can slide into these things with all the best intentions, but it ends up quite lazy thinking we all assume we're talking about the same things and we're not. And I'm not saying I've got the picture to give to you now, but I'm just saying we need to keep the door open to those questions.
Do you want to come in on that, on Anthony's question?
What was Anthony's question?
It's the last go.
Green spaces?
No. Anthony was basically saying do we undermine our chance to bring the city together if we focus on specific groups?
I do really. I speak to a lot of what people would call middle class families, middle class activists, middle class professionals who are absolutely concerned about the picture at the bottom, if you like, with the most disadvantaged. And I don't think the mechanisms exist whereby that goodwill, and I think there's an enormous amount of goodwill, can be translated into action. I think that there's a lot of talking, there's a lot of dinner party conversation about it, but actually how you get that into action is a very difficult thing. I think one of the ways that I saw this happen, and it certainly wasn't middle class person to working class person, but it was a mentorship whereby you had the old-fashioned and quite sentimental, quite frankly, model of older women helping younger women with their families, and it worked where I come from in the Midlands. It worked. It was a sort of a private organisation that did it, and it was great, where you would have the sort of grandmother figure in the absence of the grandmother coming to the young mom and saying, look, you need to change the nappy, you need to do this, let me take you here, let's go to the park. That, I mean, I don't know whether it ever did happen in the 50s, maybe it didn't, but it feels like it did. And certainly that kind of cohesion between families and communities can make a big difference, and it's almost free if you organise it. And that kind of thing definitely needs to go on more, where you're bringing this community and that community together. And I think it eradicates that isolation, certainly, that young mothers and young families feel.
Great. Look, we're going to run out of time today, so can we just thank our panel for coming? You're all obviously very keen anyway, because you turn up at 9:30 on a Friday, but if you want more events, apparently they're selling tickets downstairs. at the box office. If you want to put up funny little comments about whether Marvin did deal with the toilets this time, you'll notice there's 2 events in 2 days and no mention of public toilets. That is the problem in Bristol today.
We've got businesses opening up their toilets.
Oh Jesus! Okay, right. That's why people love local politics. That's what it's all about. Anyway, and apparently there's a Waterstones bookshop where you can buy Kit's book and have a chat with someone else. And even if you didn't like anything anyone said, there are some other books available at the same shop. And the most important thing is you need to get off your bums to get out there, because mobility also means get on with your day, not just social progress. So thank you all for coming and have a good day.